1968. Lenting 47 a.m. Wells Restaurant, 2449 7th Avenue. Bumpy Johnson clutched his chest. The coffee went cold. His chicken leg sat untouched on the plate. Hominy grits turned gray under the fluorescent lights. Frank Lucas watched the only father he'd ever known collapse into his arms. 62 years of ruling Harlem ended in a booth with red vinyl seats. "Stay clean," Bumpy whispered. Blood vessels burst in his eyes. "Promise me, Frank, stay clean." Frank nodded. His hands shook. The Godfather of Harlem went still at 1:52 a.m. 5 hours later, at 6:47 a.m., Frank Lucas made a phone call to Bangkok, Thailand. The line crackled across 8,000 miles. A man named Ike answered. Frank said 3 words. "I'm coming over." The promise lasted 11 hours. 3 days earlier, Bumpy had pulled Frank aside at Small's Paradise on 135th Street, Ellsworth Raymond. Bumpy Johnson wasn't like other gangsters. He read Shakespeare, quoted Sun Tzu, wore cashmere overcoats in the summer. For 40 years, he'd controlled Harlem's numbers rackets, policy banks, and protection networks without the Italians' permission. The bump on the back of his head had earned him his nickname. His intelligence had earned him his empire. 5 years earlier, in 1963, he'd walked out of Alcatraz after 11 years. At 62, he looked 70. Prison-aged men like that. Frank had been waiting when Bumpy came home. A North Carolina kid with nothing but ambition and a switchblade. Bumpy saw something in him. Took him on as a driver, maybe more. For 5 years, Frank watched and learned how Bumpy moved, how he thought, how he turned violence into an art form and made power look effortless. But 1968 was different. Harlem was changing. The Italians, the Genoveses, the Luchases were flooding the streets with heroin cut so weak it barely registered. 3% pure. Kids were dying. Money was flowing out of Harlem into downtown Manhattan. The old rules didn't apply anymore. Bumpy felt it. The federal indictment for drug conspiracy hanging over his head confirmed it. His kingdom was crumbling. That night at Small's, Bumpy ordered scotch. Frank drank ginger ale. "This game ends one way," Bumpy said. His voice carried weight. 50 years of authority compressed into 6 words. Prison or death, nothing else. He told Frank to stay out, stay legitimate, find another path. "You're smart enough to build something real. Don't waste it on this," Frank promised. Shook Bumpy's hand. Meant every word, for 3 days. The enemy wasn't a person. It was a system. The Italian Mafia controlled heroin in New York through a monopoly that had lasted 20 years. 5 families carved up the city like a Thanksgiving turkey. Harlem got the scraps. The dope that reached 116th Street was garbage. 1 to 3% pure, cut 7 times before it hit the corners. Addicts needed more to get high. More meant more money flowing out of black neighborhoods into Italian pockets. The math was simple and brutal. Vito Genovese had built the model. Carmen Galante perfected it. They imported from Marseille through the French connection. Turkish opium became French heroin, shipped to Montreal, trucked to New York. Every middleman took a cut. Every cut diluted the product. By the time it reached Harlem, you were buying more baby powder than dope. But the Italians didn't care. They had the connections, the ports, the politicians, the cops. No one challenged them. Not the Colombians, not the blacks, not anyone. The last guy who tried, a pusher named Tango, 270 pounds of muscle, ended up with no head, shot 4 times on a crowded sidewalk. The Italians didn't even do it themselves. Bumpy had Frank pull the trigger, a lesson in how power really worked. But Bumpy was dying. Everyone knew it. Heart disease, federal pressure, too many years carrying weight. When he fell, the vacuum would be catastrophic. The Italians were already positioning. They'd take full control. Harlem would become a colony. Frank would become irrelevant, unless the trap was time itself. No one planned it. History just moves. Wells' restaurant stayed open late on Sunday nights. Truckers, cab drivers, street cleaners, people who worked when the city slept. Bumpy liked it there. No pretension. No gangsters trying to impress him. Just good food and quiet. He'd been coming for years. Always the same booth. Third from the back, facing the door. Old habits from old wars. July 7th, 1968. The air conditioning rattled. Smelled like fried fish and pine sol. 12 customers scattered across red vinyl booths. A waitress named Dorothy worked the counter. She knew Bumpy. Everybody knew Bumpy. He wore a dark suit, no tie. His hands looked swollen. Age in prison did that. Frank sat across from him, 28 years old. Lean, quiet, observant. They'd been talking about nothing important. Weather. The Apollo Theater's new lineup. Aretha Franklin's latest record. Small talk between men who'd run out of big talk years ago. At 1:43 a.m., Dorothy brought coffee. Black for both. A chicken leg and hominy grits for Bumpy. He lifted his fork. At 1:45 a.m., his hand froze. Fork midair. The color drained from his face. To gray turned to white. His eyes went wide. Not fear. Recognition. He knew what was happening. Frank. His voice cracked. The fork clattered onto the plate. At 1:47 a.m., he grabbed his chest. Both hands. Squeezing. Like he could stop his heart from breaking by holding it together. The coffee cup tipped. Brown liquid spread across the white tablecloth. Dorothy screamed. 2 truck drivers stood up. One of them knew first aid. Didn't matter. This wasn't something you fixed with compressions. Frank caught him. Pulled Bumpy across the table. Held him. The older man's weight collapsed into his arms. 62 years. 5'8", 170 pounds. Felt like nothing. Felt like everything. Stay clean, Bumpy whispered. Blood vessels burst in his eyes, red spiderwebs against white. His breath came in short gasps. Wheezing. Wet, promise me. Stay clean. Frank nodded. Tears ran down his face. First time he'd cried since North Carolina. Since the Klan. Since everything that made him who he was. I promise, Bump. I promise. At 1:52 a.m., Ellsworth Raymond. Bumpy. Johnson stopped breathing. The room went silent. Dorothy sobbed at the counter. The truck drivers stood frozen. Frank held the body. The Godfather of Harlem died in a restaurant booth. 48 minutes after midnight became morning. Someone called the police. Someone called Bumpy's wife. Frank just sat there, holding a dead man, feeling a kingdom dissolve in his hands. What Bumpy didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Frank had already made his choice. 3 months earlier, in April 1968, Frank had traveled to San Juan, Puerto Rico. Officially, a vacation. Actually, a meeting. A man named Leslie Atkinson ran an operation out of Bangkok. Former Army sergeant. Lived in Thailand. Had access to heroin from the Golden Triangle, Burma, Laos, Thailand. The source. 98% pure before any cuts. I could ship 20 kilos a month. Maybe more. They'd talk numbers. Prices. Rotes. Frank didn't commit. Not yet. He still had Bumpy. Still had the promise of legitimacy. But he kept the door open. Kept Guy's number. Kept the option alive. May 1968. Frank met with 4 of his brothers at a warehouse on a 141st Street. Country boys from North Carolina. Farm kids who didn't know Harlem from Hollywood. That was the point. City boys steal. Country boys stay loyal. He told them about the opportunity, about cutting out the Italians, about controlling the supply chain from source to street. They listened, didn't commit, waited for Frank's signal. Frank purchased a one-way ticket to Bangkok. Departure date July 15th, 8 days after Bumpy died. He didn't know Bumpy would die on the 7th. Didn't plan it. But the universe had timing. The promise to stay clean was real. Frank meant it. In that moment, holding Bumpy in Wells' restaurant, watching the light leave his eyes, Frank Lucas believed he would honor his word. Walk away. Build something legitimate. Be the man Bumpy thought he could become. The promise lasted from 1:52 a.m. to 1:47 p.m., 11 hours. Not even half a day. At 6:47 a.m., Frank woke in his apartment on West 112th Street. He'd slept 2 hours, maybe less. The phone sat on his nightstand. He stared at it. Thought about Bumpy's words. Thought about the Italians taking over. Thought about Harlem becoming a colony. Thought about everything Bumpy had built disappearing in 6 months. He picked up the phone, dialed the international operator. Bangkok. The call took 8 minutes to connect. Ike answered on the third ring. "I'm coming over," Frank said. At 1:47 p.m., Frank Lucas walked into a travel agency on 125th Street, changed his ticket from July 15th to July 9th, 2 days away. The woman behind the counter asked if everything was all right. He said, "Everything's perfect." The promise was dead. The empire was born. At 20:00 p.m. on July 7th, Bumpy's body arrived at Harlem Hospital. Pronounced dead, caused congestive heart failure, under federal indictment. Never made it to trial. The streets knew before the newspapers. Word traveled fast in Harlem. The king was dead at 8:00 p.m. Frank attended Bumpy's viewing at a funeral home on Lenox Avenue. Bumpy's wife, Mamie, stood in black. She looked at Frank, knew, didn't say anything, just knew, the way wives know. Frank paid his respects. Left quickly, couldn't stand the weight of eyes watching him, judging him, seeing through him. July 9th, 1968. Frank Lucas boarded Pan Am Flight Sao 01 to Bangkok. First class, wore a suit, carried one suitcase. Inside a 50,000 in cash, the seed money for an empire. 13 hours later, he landed at Don Mueang Airport. Ike picked him up. They drove to the Dusit Thani Hotel. Checked into a suite. That night, they planned the operation. Golden Triangle. Direct import. No middleman. Pure heroin. They'd call it blue magic. Within 6 months, Frank controlled 116th Street. Within a year, all of Harlem. Within 2 years, he was grossing $1 million a day. The Italians never saw it coming. By the time they realized what happened, Frank had distribution networks in New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Miami. He'd recruited his brothers, the country boys, to run enforcement. He'd bought off cops, judges, politicians. He'd become everything Bumpy told him not to be. But he'd also become everything Bumpy taught him to be. Smart, strategic, ruthless when necessary, invisible when possible. For 7 years, Frank Lucas ruled Harlem the way Bumpy had ruled it, with intelligence, with discipline, with the understanding that power isn't about being seen, it's about being inevitable. Bumpy's funeral drew 2,000 people. Frank wasn't in the photographs. He was already in Thailand. July 7th, 1968. Split history into before and after. Before, Harlem's underworld operated under old rules. Gamblers, numbers runners, protection rackets, violence, sure, but controlled. Bumpy Johnson ran Harlem like a mayor ran a city, with structure, with codes. He kept the peace because peace was profitable. The heroin trade existed, but it wasn't the center. It was a side business, a necessary evil in an evil world. After heroin became the main event, Frank Lucas turned drug trafficking into an art form. Vertical integration, supply chain management, corporate efficiency applied to crime. He removed the middleman, bought directly from the source, cut his product to maintain potency while maximizing profit. He created Blue Magic, a brand, the first drug dealer to understand marketing, the first to treat heroin like a commodity with quality control standards. The Italian Mafia never recovered. Not really. By cutting them out, Frank proved the model was broken. Other dealers followed. The 1970s became the decade of independent black drug kingpins. Nicky Barnes, Leroy Nicky Barnes, Guy Fisher. All of them studied Frank's blueprint. All of them thought they could do it better. None of them did, but the cost was catastrophic. Heroin destroyed Harlem. The strong dope killed addicts who weren't used to purity. Blue magic sent users to emergency rooms in waves. Frank's empire was built on black bodies, black futures, black families shattered by addiction. He became rich by making his own people poor. By 1975, when Richie Roberts finally arrested him, the damage was permanent. Harlem wouldn't recover for decades. Frank's story reveals something ugly about promises. We make them with full hearts. We mean them completely. But intention isn't armor. When opportunity collides with grief, when power sits unclaimed, when the choice is between honoring a dying man's wish and seizing everything he built, most people break. Frank wasn't special. He was just honest enough to admit it. Real power isn't about guns or money or territory. It's about understanding the moment between promise and betrayal. The 11 hours when everything's possible. When you can choose to be better or choose to win. Frank chose to win. Bumpy knew he would. That's why he asked for the promise in the first place. Not because he thought Frank would keep it. Because he hoped, maybe this once, someone would prove him wrong. They never do. If this story showed you why promises die when empires call, hit subscribe. Drop a like if you understand why Frank couldn't walk away. Comment, what would YOU have done? Next week, when Bumpy Johnson met Malcolm X at Small's Paradise and the conversation that changed Harlem forever.